Welcome to this Fathom podcast. My name is Alan Johnson. I am the editor of Fathom Journal. I'm here with Fathom Deputy Editor Calev Ben-Dor, and I'm delighted to say with Michael Walzer. Michael is one of the most important political theorists of the democratic left of well over half a century. He is the longtime co-editor of Dissent magazine until a few years ago, and he's the author of many books. The one I'm going to pick out now, relevant to our discussion today, is he's the author of a seminal work, Just and Unjust Wars. And Michael's one of the foremost writers on what is called just war theory. So we're talking today about Israel's war on Hamas since the 7th of October 2023 and its response to the rocket attacks from Hezbollah in Lebanon. Just war thinking is a tradition of thought about warfare that stretches back many, many centuries. It is not a mere academic theory, but is a body of reasoning about war that has informed militaries and governments and international law. It's divided really into answers to two kinds of questions. One, was there a just reason for launching this particular war, which goes under the name Jus in Bello? And secondly, has the war been conducted justly, which goes under the name Jus ad bellum? So they're the two kinds of questions we're going to be exploring today with Michael. And I think Calev's going to lead us off.
Great, thank you, Alan. Michael, it's a real pleasure and honour you've joined us. So thank you very much. You've stressed in the past that it's important to distinguish the judgments we make about the conduct of war from the judgments we make about the decision to go to war, which is something that Alan just touched on in the introduction. Kind of two questions, really. There's many people, especially amongst the protesters in Western cities, who called the Hamas attacks on 7th of October justified. Many have endorsed the language of the resistance, which is actually Hamas's own language. So forgive the question, but why weren't those attacks considered a just resistance? And also, many have said Israel had a right to self-defense after those attacks, but not the right to launch an offensive war against Hamas. And the Israeli response was called disproportionate within days of its launch. What's your view of Israel's decision to launch that war rather than just limited strikes? And to what extent was there a just cause to wage war on Hamas after the 7th of October?
Yes. I should say first that the argument that there was justified resistance hangs on a claim that that the occupation of the West Bank and for a while of Gaza justified resistance. It did not, however, justify terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians. It did not justify rockets that could not be aimed at military targets. It did not justify being called by a name that the French resistance to the Nazis has made famous in the history of warfare. The Israeli response, I think, to the October 7th attacks was justified, just, and I think necessary response. I can't imagine any country in the world enduring an attack of that sort and not responding in a military way. And the arguments about proportionality are important arguments, but as I wrote very early on, they are very, very often made in bad faith. And the fact that this war was called disproportionate within days suggests or is an indication of bad faith. I first opposed proportionality arguments of this sort back in the Vietnam days when the US Army was claiming that its attacks were proportional. And the question is always proportional to what? What is the reference? And we should come back to this issue after a year of war, but proportionality was not an argument against going to war, and it was not an argument against the initial Israeli response.
Michael, just staying with this question of the justness of going to war and extending it, I think legitimately into the question of, is it just to continue the war at this point? To get your thoughts on this, I think you wrote recently in a piece of the New York Times that certainly the impression I got was that you didn't think it was. I think you even said anyone who aims at continuing the fight must be condemned because there must be a political solution. So just to query that a little, I mean, do you see an implied link there between ending the war in Gaza and a political solution? Obviously, at one level, there has to be. One can't reach a political solution while engaging in warfare. But is there a chance, play devil's advocate here, that possibly the route to a political solution and the route to peace lies through the defeat of Hamas as a governing power in Gaza, with the power to disrupt the peace process, the Abraham Accords, to disrupt the Palestinian national movement. So is there a chance that we could even say continuing the war is necessary to reach a political solution?
Right. Well, that is both a serious political discussion in the United States and, I assume, in Israel, and it raises issues of just war theory. Can there ever be a moral obligation to end a just war before victory, before total victory, which is the official word, I think, of the Israeli government, or at least of its prime minister. And this is a war being fought without any political goal except total victory. And I do believe that there can come a time when the costs of continuing the war require us to think about the possibility of pursuing the same aims politically and diplomatically. And that has been the argument of the American government. And by the way, I think this government and the combination of Biden, Blinken, and Jake Sullivan is probably the best group of Americans that has ever been sent by our government to deal with the Israeli government. These are people really committed to Israel's well-being, not just security, but Israel's well-being. And they believe that a political defeat of Hamas is now possible. That for some months they've believed that. Maybe they believe that too soon, but I believe now that that is the right argument. The costs of the war, and then we have to talk about that. And right now, of the way the war is being waged, make it necessary to look for a political solution, which means a victory by other means, pursuing the victory by other means.
Okay, thank you, Michael. To ask on a slightly different path, the separate question of whether Israel has always conducted its war against Hamas in line with just war rules. So let's just kind of take issues one by one. The first one, the accusation of genocide. Israel was accused of not waging a war but carrying out a genocide. Also, almost from the beginning, it's only been a mantra for around a year now, and it seems to have seeped into parts of Western consciousness as some form of truth, which is a disaster for Israel, and it's also a disaster for Jews in the diaspora. What's your view of this genocide charge? Fair or unfair?
Oh, it's radically unfair. An example of dumbing genocide down to turn it into a political slogan. Look, here in the United States, some of the theorists of settler colonialism are telling us that any effort to bring equal rights to Native Americans is genocidal because it invites them to accept the culture, the political culture of the settlers. No, the charges, there is no basis for this charge. It is an example of politicizing an important legal and moral idea.
And Michael, related, there's been an international debate about the question of humanitarian aid to Gaza, and be interesting to get your thoughts about how humanitarian aid in general should be thought of in just war terms, and also in this particular case. Just to give you a little bit of background about Fathom, there were some pretty outrageous comments in the early days of the war after by Israeli commentators and some Israeli politicians calling for the total siege of Gaza to get the hostages back. Myself and the then deputy editor, Giacomo Giacomin, wrote a piece in Fathom in direct response to those calls as early as October 2023. And we placed it cheek by jowl with those calls in the journal. And we titled our article "For the Total Defeat of Hamas Against the Total Siege of Gaza." I'm not sure we could have been more explicit about what Fathom's position was. Jack and I said a siege would be wrong in principle. We also added it would be a disaster for building international alliances and for the battle for global public opinion, but our headline was wrong in principle. Some people have tried to ignore that and not to notice Fathom's published editorial positions, accusing us of supporting positions we explicitly opposed in writing. But that's our issue. So in the years since, this debate has roiled forward questions, is there any kind of a siege? Is Israel doing enough to allow in humanitarian aid? Who's responsible for the failures of distribution of the aid? What kind of role has UNRWA played? Is UNRWA a legitimate UN agency? Has it been infiltrated by Hamas? Both true. I'd just like to ask you whether you've tracked these debates and what your thinking is about the relationship between humanitarian aid and just war.
Yes. Well, I think we have to begin a little before your question by talking about what kind of a war this is. It's an asymmetric war. It's a war designed by Hamas. And it is a war that is being fought not only against an organization, a military terrorist organization embedded in the civilian population. It's also being fought against an enemy entrenched below the civilian population. Hamas has constructed what isn't recognized often enough in analyses of the war, an underground city. It's not tunnels, calling it tunnels is misleading. It is an underground city. There are tunnels that you can drive a truck through. There are shops making weapons. There are storage rooms for weapons. There are dormitories for fighters. There are apartments for the leaders. There are every form of communication is available. So a substantial part of this underground city is successfully ventilated. This is an extraordinary achievement, and it has drastically affected the conduct of the war. And this has not been talked about enough. So Israel fights on the ground and claims to have cleared a part of, let's say, northern Gaza. Now, if it has actually cleared and occupied a part of northern Gaza, if it is in military control, then it has obligations to protect and provide for the civilian population in the area it controls. One of the difficulties is there has never been an area in Gaza where the IDF is in full control. And that's partly because of the underground city from which fighters can emerge at any point and challenge Israeli control. And that makes it very difficult for Israel to do what a victorious army has to do, and that is to provide services to the civilian population. Now, has Israel tried hard enough to provide those services? That's sitting in New York. I'm not sure I can make a judgment of that sort. There have been members of the Israeli government who have tried to obstruct the delivery of aid. And there is the whole question of the war against UNRWA. And on UNRWA, I have a position that is mostly the opposite of some of my friends here. I believe that UNRWA has always been an organization that should have been abolished from the beginning. It should have been assimilated integrated into the other UN agency that deals with refugees around the world. UNRWA has been a political organization sustaining the conflict, organized to sustain the conflict by creating a diaspora which looks back on its right to return. But right now, UNRWA seems to be an organization that can effectively deliver services. Hamas gets its cut because that's the kind of organization UNRWA is, but so do civilians. And if you don't allow an organization like UNRWA and can't provide administrative services yourself, then you're going to get gangs stealing supplies. You're going to get Hamas stealing supplies. You're going to get the chaos and the black market and all that we have seen in parts of Gaza. And responsibility for that lies partly with Hamas, maybe mostly with Hamas, but Israel has not done everything it could. And that's why the Americans intervened with an effort to create a beach where you could deliver supplies and dropping supplies from the air. That was all an effort to break the Israeli siege by sea and air. And it was a friendly effort because it was really in Israel's interest to provide effective humanitarian assistance as much as it possibly could. And how much it possibly could is something I can't say.
Michael, I'm wondering if you can help with some baffled Israelis who might find it difficult to understand why it's their responsibility. Now, I just say, I think 9 months into the war, Israel controlled the Philadelphia corridor, the border with Egypt. But before then, there was a border with another country, with Egypt. And so I'm intrigued, under just war theory, what is the responsibility of a country fighting another to actively provide it with humanitarian aid when that territory borders a third country, when it was attacked from that territory? And I think a lot of Israelis are maybe even kind of baffled of why, having been attacked in such a way by Hamas, fundamentalist, Islamist, maximalist organization that's promised to attack it again and again and again, why it's Israel that needs to continue to provide it with electricity, often for free. What would you say to people who find that difficult to get their heads around?
Think about the logic of a standard siege. Old-fashioned. It's one of the oldest forms of war in human history. You surround a city, you cut off supplies, and you sit and wait. And eventually, at some point, the inhabitants of the city get hungry. They begin to press the government of the city to surrender. And again in military history, the government of the city surrenders. And that the essential logic of siege warfare is that there is a moral and political connection between the inhabitants of the city and the rulers of the city. Now, there's no such connection between Hamas and the people of Gaza. So the siege was never going to be anything more than a war against civilians. And the more civilians are killed or starved, the worse it is for Israel. And Hamas planned this because all asymmetric wars are also political wars. And whatever you do on the ground, the high-tech army ends up killing. And there is a line that I've often quoted from an American colonel in Afghanistan in 2010, who said, "The more civilians we kill, the more certain it is that we will lose the war." And that was Israel's position. And so it certainly didn't make military sense to carry on a siege. It was punishing people almost in the service of Hamas. You were working for Hamas. And all over the world, it was preordained that you would be blamed for the victims. And so it seemed to me from the beginning that you had to do everything possible. And it had to be as visible as possible to help the citizens of Gaza who did not have a government acting in their defense or in their support. You were not fighting a normal state where there is supposedly some connection between the people and the government. There was no moral connection. And so because of that, you had moral obligations.
Michael, thanks for that. Would just war theory have anything to say about Egypt and whether maybe bordering Gaza, it had responsibilities, or does the theory tend to focus upon the contending parties?
No, neighboring states, complicit states can have. Look, the embargo of Gaza was a joint operation from the beginning, and the Egyptians really never did their full part. They never really dealt with the resupply of Hamas from Iran. Some of the most important tunnels were tunnels into Egypt, and I assume the Egyptians knew about the tunnels and officials in Sinai were bribed, or I don't know why, but yes, Israel, Egypt had a role to play, and they were part of the humanitarian. They were a source of the humanitarian supply, and they are also responsible for not providing enough. But they had no control over any spaces in Gaza, and Israel presumably did.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on a little to the conflict in Lebanon. You wrote an article recently in the New York Times that got a lot of attention, a lot of controversy, and some responses. And it was about a number of things, but it was certainly part about the pager attacks. You called them war crimes and terrorist attacks because they failed to respect the distinction between combatants and civilians, which is obviously a distinction central to just war theory. So the verdict surprised people, I think, maybe some of your friends. And I just immediately, just to open up with a very general question of, can you explain your thinking here?
Yes. I have had to do that again and again. I think in analogies. And here I imagined that Israel gave pagers to 10,000 reservists, choosing important people who might be useful in a crisis. And suddenly these pagers began exploding while the reservists were at home with their families, or shopping, or in a cafe, or walking with friends. And it seemed to me that it would take me roughly 30 seconds to call that a terrorist attack. And I thought that if that was so, then this attack on the Hezbollah page holders was also a terrorist attack. Now, one of the responses has simply been, the most common response has simply been, but they're terrorists and we're the good guys, and so they can't do it to us, but we can do it to them. One person wrote to me and said simply, we're the children of God, so we can do things like that. That wasn't the response of my philosopher friends in Israel, but I think they also in some way rejected the analogy, which seems to me quite plausible. It's a crucial part of the way we think about just war theorists think. Soldiers can be attacked on the battlefield. They can be attacked when they're on the way to the battlefield. They can be attacked when they're retreating from the battlefield. They can be attacked at any time when they are in training. They can be attacked when they are resting at a military base. They can't be attacked when they are on furlough at home with their families. And I was just trying to apply that principle. But I also was acting with a sense that this would not have been permitted by the old IDF rules of engagement. I think that's right, but I may be wrong. I know some of the people who wrote the IDF rules of engagement. So I don't know what they would say about the old rules and the way the IDF is fighting right now. But it did not seem to me to be the sort of thing that we, the good guys, should be doing.
Thank you, Michael. That's very interesting. We just want to relate back to one of the responses that was written by Alexander Jacobson and Azar Gat
I've read it.
in an article called Real Clear Politics. And one of the things that they said was that your suggested rules of engagement are every terrorist's paradise. So I just wanted to explore that a
Yes.
little bit in order to kind of expand on the issue. So they said the pager attack was, a matter of fact, one of the most targeted that a state can possibly launch against a terrorist or guerrilla force operating amongst a civilian population. They claim there was much greater precision than is usually possible. It was clearly aimed at actual enemy combatants with far less risk, although I'd add obviously no risk, but far less risk of collateral damage, and indeed inflicting much less damage than most such operations. They point out that only Hezbollah operatives use the pages, not ordinary Lebanese, and not even mere political supporters of the Hezbollah. So I guess you've partially responded to this already, but when you hear arguments like that, how do you respond?
Well, I think that Azer and Jacobson have inferred from my little article what I didn't intend to say. They have inferred what I did not imply. I don't see any resemblance between the people with pagers, with their families, and Hamas fighters hiding in a building, waiting to fight, or firing from a civilian apartment, or storing weapons in the basement of an apartment house or in a mosque. There's nothing. There's no analogy there with the pagers. And I have written again and again justifying fighting against terrorists or insurgents of any sort who hide in the civilian population, who fight from the civilian population, who use civilians as cover, who deliberately aim at forcing the enemy to kill civilians. None of that is present in the pager case. They were not hiding. They were simply with their families. They were exactly like Israeli reservists at home, waiting to be called up, but not yet called up. The argument has to be that these are terrorists and they fight in a certain way, and we may have to imitate things that they do that we wouldn't do if we weren't fighting against terrorists. And that raises very large issues about organizations like Hezbollah, which is on the one hand, a terrorist organization, and on the other hand, a government more effective than the official government of Lebanon, with health ministries and welfare ministries and many civil servants and cops directing traffic, all of that. Are they all terrorists? Are they all subject to attack at any point, wherever they can be found? There was one item on my, I watched too much on the internet, but one item came up, and it may have been false, saying that among the pager holders were health officials who might be needed in an emergency. That may be false. Similarly, the numbers. Hezbollah says that 1,500 of its pager holders were wounded or killed, mostly wounded. The Lebanese hospital officials say that 2,700 people showed up at the hospitals. That would be 1,200 non-Hamas people, if those figures are right. And I've learned that we have to be skeptical of everybody's figures in this war. But I don't accept the idea that what I wrote in that article in any way delegitimizes, makes impossible a war against terrorists or against any insurgents who use civilian cover. I don't see that. I have written so often defending what Israel is doing in this war.
Yeah. Michael, if so Israel has said that Hezbollah was planning a kind of October the 7th style attack on an even larger scale in the north. We have Iran in the background, which has fired 2 sets now of missiles and could fire a third. Israel's engaged in a multi-front war. Playing devil's advocate a bit here, see what you think. But is it the case in just war thinking that, I hate these expressions, but if the bad guys are going to win, is there flex in just war thinking that if it's a kind of existential question, some of these considerations have to give way to survival?
Yes, there is a chapter in Just and Unjust Wars dealing with real emergency situations. And
But you don't think that applied here?
I don't think Israel is right now in danger of being defeated, destroyed. Israel is not alone. Israel has effective international support, which is one reason why I now think continuing the war by political means is possible. The extreme emergency that I wrote about, and which I thought applied to Britain in the early years before the US came in, right in the early years after 39, I accepted Churchill's use of that idea of extreme emergency. I don't think that is Israel's situation right now. In fact, again, just going back to the Trump support in Israel, Biden produced, he literally produced this coalition of Western European countries with the United States, with Sunni Arab countries that actually sprang to the defense of Israel against the Iranian attacks. Yes.
Yeah.
BHL, the French intellectual Bernard Henri Levy, has written a book called Israel Alone. And I think it's a bad title. There is a long Jewish tradition of wringing our hands and saying the whole world is against us. It's not true. And I think it's one of the failures of the current government of Israel to recognize the support it has. Not maybe on Harvard, Columbia campus, but among the governments of the Western world. And to use that support. Anyway, the answer, I think, is I am thankful that it is not the kind of situation that you described.
If we could just based on that answer, Michael, if we could enter hypothetical land, how does just war theory work when there is an existential war against non-state actors who are within civilian populations, who are, have no qualms about killing Israeli civilians, etc. So I know you've said that that's not the situation, but theoretically, what gives within just war theory in such a situation?
Well, any moral rules that would govern what we might think of as normal or ordinary warfare could be violated if the violation was effective. Here, the defense of breaking the rules and the claim of necessity would also require that this was the best thing to do or the only thing to do in these circumstances. That was the British claim in the early years. They were bombing German cities. They couldn't, given the aiming devices at the time, they couldn't aim very well at factories. And so they abandoned any effort to aim at factories and simply hit the residential areas, hit the city. The target was the city, including all of its civilian housing. And I thought, as an extreme measure, as the only way to resist Nazism, and in those years, this could be defended. It couldn't be defended as soon as it became possible to fight differently. So I can't tell you which rule, because that would have to be an argument made by military people.
Calev, I think we've covered some of the questions. I don't know if you want to talk about this issue of civilian environments and just war thinking within those environments, maybe next.
I can't hear you. Yeah.
Sorry, Mike, I don't want to push you too much on the New York Times article, because I feel like every Shabbat dinner you probably had for months afterwards was, I can just imagine a group of people, accusingly criticizing you of whatever. But if I understood it correctly, which I may not have, so your argument was because Hezbollah operatives were among Lebanese civilians and weren't kind of actively engaged in terrorism, they should have had some kind of immunity, and that the pages were war crimes in part because they were at home with their families or sitting in cafes or shopping in food markets, basically among civilians. So when I was reading that, I mean, I guess the first thing I thought of was basically Bin Laden. Bin Laden's also at home with his family. I think maybe his daughter's killed in the raid. So would that raid have been outside of kind of just war rules? And then I guess some people have asked whether should Israel not have attacked Hezbollah and Hamas terrorists in such an environment? If they don't do that, are they not simply undefeatable? As in, Hamas and Hezbollah can create the situation where Israel can't morally attack them.
One of the first things I wrote I think in the first piece I did after October 7th, I said it cannot be the case that the insurgents or the terrorists can make it impossible to fight a just war against them. It can't be the case. And I don't think what I wrote in that article in any way makes it impossible to fight. I don't see, look, bin Laden was not an ordinary person. He was not only the symbol of the Islamist terrorism, it was also, so we believed, still directing that organization. And so he was a legitimate military target, and his family was at risk, and everything should have been done to kill him and not anyone else. But that is never possible in this kind of warfare. I am and have always been skeptical about assassinating leaders because of the danger that you get somebody smarter and more vicious than the person you kill. But I am not opposed to doing that. I did think that the killing of the political leader of Hamas in Tehran at the time when you were actually engaged in negotiations with him had to be taken as a sign that your government did not want those negotiations to succeed. And as reported here by leaks from the US government, that is also the view, not of the particular assassination, but of the negotiations. That is the view of some of the Israeli negotiators, that they believed they were being continually undercut by a government that did not want the negotiations to succeed.
So, Michael, you've anticipated one of the questions I was going to ask there. So I'll ask something slightly different, and it may be that Calev has another question, or this may be our last question. I'm not sure, but I wrote a piece which may surprise a lot of people, being against a ground invasion, or at least very fearful of a ground invasion. Having gone through the whole Iraq experience and the post 9/11 wars and seen what happened to invasions and the absence of a plan, and how things can be worse because of invasions, not better. I still don't see a plan in Gaza at all. I have no idea what Israel wants for post-war governance or how it intends to involve either its Gulf partners or America. None at all. What alarms me most of all is, given I guess the job we've got and where I am, is the shift in global public opinion towards Israel and frankly towards Jewish people since October the 7th, which is just horrifying, absolutely horrifying. And we're seeing things we've never really seen before. I kind of thought that was going to happen in the piece I wrote in the early weeks after October the 7th, and kind of predicted it, because I thought it was obvious that a full onslaught against against Hamas in Gaza would produce this level of casualties and this level of anger and hatred, and would be exploited by anti-Semites to produce anti-Jewish hatred. Do you look at the experience of the last year and think, what conclusions do you draw for Israel's situation, which is that it's surrounded by an Iranian ring of fire? It's facing not just normal enemies, but eliminationist anti-Semites who would like to see the country annihilated. It's a very small country that can't afford to make mistakes in war, and certainly can't afford to lose one. Yet when it fights, it's producing this huge global backlash against itself. I'm not saying asking you to have an answer to any of this, but I'm just it's what we in Fathom are troubled with all the time, and I just wondered what you're thinking about that kind of dilemma was.
Well, you wrote at that time then with great foresight that I should have had, since I've written so much about how the high-tech army regularly loses wars against low-tech insurgents in the French in Algeria, the Americans in Vietnam, the Americans in Afghanistan. But what were you suggesting as an alternative right after, when you opposed the ground invasion?
At the time, I said to create a much more secure envelope around the Strip, targeted airstrikes on Hamas members and leadership and infrastructure, and a drive to resurrect the Saudi entry into the Abraham Accords, and to extend that to some kind of a horizon for the renewal of the peace process. It may have been all utopian, but I went through the Iraq experience quite close up by working with the Iraqi trade unions and going over to America and talking to people in the administration about support for the trade unions. And I just left that whole experience very jaundiced about the idea of military interventions. I wasn't sure that the West was capable of pulling them off. Having said that, I think Israel has certainly shown so far the will and the fighting spirit, but what I don't see is a coherent plan for Gaza after the war, or for maintaining international alliances, or for maintaining global public opinion. My own sense is what Israel doesn't understand is that we live in a world now where foreign policy isn't decided by 10 people in the Foreign Office and the editor of the Times and so on, and you can ignore the street. It's not how it works now. You can see the way the Labour government in this country has moved on policy in response to the weekly demonstrations. I think governments are now much more sensitive to, for various reasons, to large-scale public opinion shifts around foreign policy issues, and I think they're very influenced by it. So I worry about all of that. I don't have easy answers to any of it, but I'm not sure Israel does either at the moment.
Right. Well, I think you were right then. Although even conducting the war from the air would have produced massive civilian casualties because of the way Hamas was
Yeah.
was simply using the civilian population and inviting the killing of civilians. But a full-scale ground invasion without an end, without a purpose, without a clear end in view, that was a terrible mistake. And even now, what is going on in North Gaza, well, just think about that for a moment, because it turns out there are 400,000 Palestinians living in this area where we on American television have seen nothing but rubble. There are 400,000 Palestinian civilians living, presumably most of them in apartment buildings. And now Israel is going in again and moving all of them out when important government ministers are hoping for the elimination of any Palestinian presence in northern Gaza and moving in Israeli settlers. And the government does not have a clear alternative view of what to do. What is now going on, you know, from the beginning, we got highly exaggerated reports of the destruction. But now the reports have turned accurate. And Israel is, well, okay. Right now, what is going on in northern Gaza is an unjust war. And it does bring into focus the original decision to send in ground troops without a mission, without a clear mission. And there were IDF officers who, from the beginning, were pleading for a clear statement of what they were supposed to do, what it would mean to finish. Well, precisely for that reason, it is now morally necessary to stop.
So, Mike, I just want to follow up on something. I think within Israel, there's controversy about what exactly is the plan in northern Gaza, and you're right that there are some Israeli ministers who'd be perfectly happy to restore settlements in Gaza, although for what it's worth, Netanyahu has said that's not government policy, and if it is, then someone needs to tell all of the soldiers who are sacrificing their lives that that's why they're sacrificing it. And I would agree with you that the weakness the government has is its real consistent failure to specify war aims. Well, not war aims, but the day after. But I'm just wondering if you take the settlement stuff away, because that would be deeply unpopular in Israel, and perhaps I'm being naively optimistic, but I find it difficult to imagine a situation in which there is a terrorist organization that is entrenched within a civilian population, which we've talked about, and the IDF gives that population an opportunity to move south. Again, you could argue they're too weak, there's nowhere to go, etc. But gives the civilian population an opportunity to move. So just that terrorists are left. In a situation where Hamas, I don't know, prevent them from leaving or whatever, where's the can you emphasize the immorality? I mean, your initial thing was it's immoral because of restoring the settlements. But if you take the settlements out, can you tease out what is the terrible aspect or the immoral aspect of the current operation in the north of the Strip?
Yeah. Let me again go back. I wrote about exactly this situation in Vietnam, where the Americans would drop leaflets and loudspeakers from the air and tell people to move out, and then claim that anyone who hadn't moved out was a terrorist or a Viet Cong and subject to attack. The problem is that large numbers of people don't move. They don't move because they're old, aged, and firm. Like me, I could have great difficulty moving out of this apartment if I were sent a leaflet from some military organization. They don't move because they're old, or they have parents who are old and sick. They're taking care of them. And they don't move because they are afraid that everything they own will be looted and destroyed, and there won't be anything to come back to. So the fact is that 400,000 Palestinians did not leave Gaza City or wherever they are now, probably for those reasons. And you can force them to leave now. You can empty northern Gaza of civilians, or try to, but there will be a very large residual number of people who won't leave. And you also have to take into account what leaving means in these situations, because they are probably right that there will be nothing to come back to. And people have mementos and valuables things that mean everything to them in their home. Leaving is very hard. It wasn't effective in Vietnam. Our free fire zones were murderous for civilians and not effective in defeating the Viet Cong, or not as effective as they were hoped to be. So I don't know. I want to raise another issue with you, since we're all together here, and that is the question of prisoners. We've had a lot of ugly reports about the treatment of prisoners taken in Gaza, and there are apparently thousands of them now. They are not recognized as prisoners of war because they are by definition terrorists, but they're not ever going to be put on trial as terrorists with evidence against them. So they live in this limbo. They don't have the rights of criminal. They don't have the rights of POWs. They are not allowed visits by the Red Cross. And this is another example of the argument that says we're the good guys and they're all terrorists, and we can treat them badly. And there are reports now in the American press, but they started with 9/7/2, of Israeli soldiers saying that prisoners have been used as human shields, forced to walk into booby-trapped buildings in front of Israeli soldiers. Those are extremely damaging reports here. I suspect they are not universally true, but they may be true partly. And this again has something, there is some movement away from the old rules of engagement. This now figures quite largely in the criticism of Israel here.
Yeah.
Is there an Israeli response? You're the guy that responds, Harari, the admiral, the very stiff guy who
Yeah, Daniel Hagari.
yeah, he is not impressive. He is absolutely stiff. He cites what sounds like official government words. He does not take questions, at least never on American television. You have virtually no effective public relations. That's something also I don't understand.
I mean, so that's a much larger question, Michael, that I think maybe even Alan and I might have different opinions on. I always think that Israel can do better in these things, but I kind of come back to the in fact, I'm almost certain Alan might have a different perspective to me. I always come back to that story about the hospital, because in the days beforehand, I remember there were these arguments that Israelis were, and Jews were, kind of having to prove the depravity of the brutal massacres that had undergone. We kind of had to, every small detail we had to kind of produce evidence for as victims. And then within 2 minutes of an explosion in the car park of a hospital in Gaza, everyone was talking about 500 dead. And my feeling is, and again, this is not to excuse poor PR or poor spokespeople, whoever they may be, is that sometimes I'm not convinced it's about facts. It's as if we feel that if only, I don't know, what the Israeli spokesperson would smile, would have nice British accented English, would, A, B, C, D, E, there wouldn't have been protests in Columbia and Harvard already on the 7th of October blaming the Israeli government for Hamas actions. And I think the government itself has to come under criticism for the very disturbing comments that many of its ministers said that Netanyahu did not. I mean, he kind of said that's not our policy, but he didn't fire them or anything. The absence of a strategic vision that absolutely would have helped. There absolutely are critiques, and there's no question that for me, in a civilian army, there'll be many people who will act in ways that are unbecoming of IDF soldiers. But I feel like the response of the world is not really directly connected to the absence of an Israeli strategic vision. There were people calling in Sydney to gas the Jews on the 8th of October 2023. There were people celebrating in Times Square on the 7th. And obviously, there's many people who aren't like that, but I'm not convinced that the issue is a PR issue. I think it's something wider than that. But maybe Alan disagrees. I don't know. But there are very worrying stories that have come out. Listen, this has been a year-long war where of a people that were attacked in their most kind of sensitive, vulnerable places. People feeling traumatized. A brutal war that doesn't really have any easy things, and within that, there will undoubtedly be things that can't be justified. Absolutely. But those are kind of my I don't want it to turn into me giving the content, but those are kind of my initial feelings.
Caleb, there's something different here in the U.S. The American people are overwhelmingly supportive of Israel in this war. Every poll shows 85% choose Israel over Hamas. You have a public that is just ready to listen if you had effective people speaking. Yes, there is new anti-Semitism in America, and some of it goes along with being anti-Semitic and pro-Israel on the right, on the American right, as on some parts of the European right. There is this new phenomenon, but you can't. The idea is that the world is just waiting to think badly about Israel. Yeah, there are people in the world who are waiting to think badly, eager to think badly about Israel. But you have world sympathy, and in the U.S. you have massive public sympathy. So it's you need to talk to those people in a decent way. You need to, your guy isn't the right one. He's the one who appears every night on American television. We are given damning photos, and he just says, "No, that's not what we're doing."
This past week, the office that BICOM is connected to in the UK was daubed with red paint, etc., by Palestinian Action Group, and it was very nice. In the tweet, they said that, what did they say, Alan? That BICOM is the most influential British pro-Israel. So if we're so influential, maybe I'll use some of that influence also to pass Michael your messages on higher up within Israel. We'll see what we can do.
I mean, Caleb's given a perspective from Israel, which I won't challenge. Just from the UK and from someone who wants to see Israel exist and thrive, I've said for a long time that we really underestimate the strategic thinking behind the global anti-Israel movement. And I've said for a long time, it seems to me reasonably obvious that it goes in these stages. One is to demonize Israel. Second is to isolate it diplomatically. And third is then to allow the local hard men to deal with Israel in their own way. And that would mean practically an Israeli missile strike in which there wasn't an international coalition knocking them out the sky and sending the fleet to the Gulf and so on and so forth. And I don't think we're anywhere near that yet, but I think that is the strategy. And it struck me as necessary, therefore, to understand that Israel should amend its own diplomacy and its own public diplomacy and rhetoric, and I think it's coalition building accordingly, which would mean, like, for instance, with the piece that Jack and I wrote back in October, we were saying Israel should be drowning Gaza in humanitarian aid. It should be flying it in and sending it in and in every conceivable way that it could. Now, I'm not saying that's easy in a war zone. I'm not naive, but the scenes of either Israelis blocking trucks or Israeli ministers talking about total siege are a diplomatic disaster for Israel. Just awful and politically stupid and should stop. And secondly, the war fighting. And again, I'm not talking about a particular tactical strategy in any situation, but war fighting needs to be conducted with the understanding that that global strategy is in place and it, over the last year, has made advances. The demonization of Israel has made advances, as, by the way, has the isolation of Israel diplomatically. I mean, we just need to think, compared to the Blair and Brown years, think of the contrast between David Lammy said he would arrest Netanyahu if he was in the UK, if the ICC told him to. The UK abandoned its joint representations to the ICC with Germany. The UK introduced partial bans on arms sales to Israel. The UK now has 4 so-called Gaza independent MPs, and the Labour Party is petrified of losing its support amongst Muslim people in Britain. All this is unprecedented and a radical change from where we were under Blair and Brown. And people, I think, need to wake up and understand that Israel needs to conduct itself differently in terms of its rhetoric and its diplomacy and its public-facing people. So I don't know about this particular guy, but I think Michael's right that it's crucial to get. I mean, I've said for a long time I would promote Einat Wilf to most situations in which Israel needs to put a public face on. But yeah, change is needed, I think.
Yes, I agree, and I also believe that in military situations, prudence is also a moral requirement. And yeah, Israel is fighting what is, I agree, an existential war. At least the most important and frightening war in its history. And it is doing this with the worst government in its history.
Okay, somber note to end on, but I think we've been talking for well over an hour now. So, Michael, in terms of being thoughtful and nuanced and honest and candid, that's one of the best discussions I've heard of all these issues for a long time. So we're so grateful for you coming on with us today, and so grateful for your support for Fathom from the outset, by the way, which people may not know about, but from when we had the idea, let alone before we launched, you were very supportive, and your counsel was great. So thanks very much again.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to the two of you. Yes.